The following video is based upon true crime content. Therefore, it may contain images and/or language that some find disturbing. For this reason, viewer discretion is advised. Hi, everyone. Welcome in. Today, I would like to talk about a couple of different topics. We had previously touched on Richard Allen, the Delphi case where Abby and Libby were unalived in 2017. This was in Indiana. And there's a lot of controversy over this case. It's high profile. You either paid attention to it or you didn't. You were tired of hearing about it. I want to pinpoint some things that I heard in an interview with his attorneys, because apparently there was a gag order. And so nobody could speak out until now that the trial's over. So here's what's going on. They say that right now, nobody's been able to talk to Richard Allen since he's in limbo, right? Because he's been convicted. They have sentenced him to 130 years in prison. And he's in that transition period to go to prison. They say he has no contact with his family or his lawyers. And basically, it's like the DOC limbo is where he's at. So they had some major questions when they were interviewed, and they did come out of the gate doing interviews right away. And you guys know me. You know that I pretty much will take the evidence and look at it and decide for myself whether or not I believe in what's going on. I mean, for example, the Jennifer and James Crumbley trial. You know, it took me a while to come around on that one. I really didn't like seeing Jennifer and James Crumbley go into trial. But then when they got in court and I saw the way they ignored their son, that's the part that bothered me the most, right? On this trial in particular, I've always had a thing about Richard Allen. Just something was off. Something felt off about him. And then when he got into jail, the man deteriorated when he got into jail. And he started acting strange. He started spewing out different stuff. He was throwing his feces. He was running around naked. He was confessing constantly confessing. Something wasn't right about it all. Here's what his attorneys are saying. While he was incarcerated, I guess, okay, so the backstory is that from the attorney's perspective, there seems to be that you're talking about a small town, everybody's in cahoots, and I think that they feel like there's been some backhanded things going on in this case. And guys, when you look at what they presented here, there could be a reason for them to either have a retrial or throw out his convictions. This is serious stuff of what we're looking at. When they would go meet with him in the jail, they would always record his meetings with his attorneys. And that's not the norm. That's, from what I understand, they weren't supposed to be doing. I mean, they could watch him or whatever, but it seemed like the audio should not have been on, They ended up moving him 3 hours away to another facility before the trial without any notice to his legal team. His detention circumstances were very unusual, unlike other prisoners. And it went beyond like solitary confinement for his safety. It wasn't like, oh, they were doing this first. It was just really strange. They said he was treated inhumane prior to conviction. Okay. So I'm not even going to jump on the Odin thing right now. Y'all, I've talked about it a little bit, but I'm going to leave that out for a second. What I want to show you guys is what's going on with the things that are being brought up. And this first item that's being brought up, it didn't surprise me, but it pisses me off. You guys remember Ron Logan? He was the one that owned the property on the other side of the bridge, the area that the girls were walking towards. He was also the gentleman who had a lot of mysterious background things going on. He'd had some criminal history. He had women speaking out about how abusive he was. So there's a lot of different things about this man. And his voice in one of the interviews really got to me. So apparently he was incarcerated. He was their main suspect at one point in time. And I don't understand why everything got dropped. But he died in 2022 due to COVID. I feel in my heart of hearts like after he died, They wanted a scapegoat, and that's when they went after Richard Allen. Like, they needed to put somebody under the prison for what was done. That town was reeling over these murders. So here's what they say about the confession that Ron Logan actually made. Remember, a lot of this stuff wasn't allowed in court.
Found. The confession apparently took place inside the Newcastle Correctional Facility, where Logan was serving his sentence for a probation violation. It's there that he got to talking with another inmate in his cell block, Ricky Davis. In a letter signed by Davis in June 2017, he recounted Logan's confession, writing, quote, "He told me he was the one who killed those girls, that it got out of hand. He walked with them in the woods to his property. The girls wanted to turn back and said something about calling the police. Logan apparently went on to say that he, quote, grabbed the youngest girl to reassure her it was okay. However, they panicked, and he also panicked. Logan indicated he ended up cutting the oldest with a box cutter. He went on telling me that he killed both of them because it was taken too far." At the time of that supposed confession, the fact that the girls' throats had been slit and that a box cutter was the likely murder weapon were not public knowledge.
Not public knowledge. Now, I know I'm like you guys when it comes to these prison rats. You know, you don't know if you're to believe them or not. We don't know if this guy's getting anything for saying that. Probably not, actually. He probably did not get anything for coming forward because of the fact that this is all coming from the defense right now. But this was known information that they kept out of the court. So it's very shady. This town needs to be investigated. What is it? This town needs an enema, okay? There's something going on here that's not right.
In fact, it wasn't until the trial late last year that the forensic pathologist who performed the autopsies testified that a box cutter was the likely murder weapon.
Now, looking back, they're able to say, well, with that box cutter information, that opened the door. Once they put box cutter and they had a suspect who confessed to using a box cutter, we definitely should have been able to get into at least this other suspect.
However, Judge Fran Gull ruled that the defense team could not put forward any theories about other potential suspects. In the early days of the Delphi investigation,
See, they couldn't bring in any theories of other potential suspects. And there were a lot of them. Remember Keegan Kline? The big guy that he's in jail right now for something. I don't know if he's involved in it or not. There was some hubbub about him using that online profile to lure the girls. I think the craziness of it all was maybe it's not so flamboyant like everybody says it is. Like everybody was like, oh, there's a bunch of men, they're all Odinist and they're all in together on it. Maybe there are Odinist. Maybe I think there are from everything that I've seen in this case. But maybe this wasn't connected to that. Maybe they were just helping out. I don't, if that makes any sense. And I'm not saying the judge was dirty, but why wasn't the defense able to show that there were other suspects that could have been involved in this? That's not a fair trial to me, you guys. That's just not a fair trial to me. You got somebody that confessed. You got other guys that were linked to everything. They were talking to the girls online. That's reasonable doubt. That's the case right there. So why wouldn't they allow that? Again, I haven't been following this case from the beginning, but I'm just so irked by all this because I was keeping up with it on my own.
Logan was a prime suspect, so much so that the FBI was able to secure a search warrant for his home. It's unclear if they ever found anything connecting him to the murders, but Allen's attorneys say that confession and the details in it exculpates Mr. Allen and would probably produce a different result at a retrial.
If they find out that the prosecution knowingly presented misinformation, Allen could be released from jail and his conviction could be completely overturned. So in these motions, here's what they've gone through. They've said it's a 24-page motion of errors that Richard Allen's attorneys have filed. In the motion of errors, they state that they want his conviction vacated. Another huge issue at hand during the trial was the timeline of this van. Okay, if you're not familiar with the trial. So at some point in time during what they say Richard Allen was taking these girls by knife point, gunpoint, whatever it was, to the location where he was going to unalive them, there was a van that drove behind one of the back roads. Now, this back road led to this guy's house. He drove a van. And supposedly the van spooked Allen, and that's what made him unalive the girls rather than assault them. That's what was said, okay? Now, what his defense attorney believed, they're wondering what happened while he was in jail. They believe that while he was in jail, he was being pressured by someone. I don't know if it was prisoners. I don't know if it was part of the jail staff. I don't know what that was. But that's what they feel like. He was being fed information to say certain things. And that's why he lost it the way he did, because he was in a very tight position. And I think a lot of it was them holding his wife and his daughter over his head, their safety, things like that. Again, you guys, this is all speculation, okay? I don't know all this for a fact, but there's a lot of people reporting on it that this is the way it all went down. The problem is that when you're dealing with a shady government officials here, you don't know what's true and what's not. Some people say, well, let's just drop it. He has been convicted. He's been found guilty. But when you look at some of the stuff that they've put out here, there's a lot of stuff missing, you guys. So let's look at this next clip here.
Eric, you talk with some of these legal experts who say these motions will bring this case likely back to court.
That's what they expect. This is the 24-page motion of errors. In it, Richard Allen's defense team outlines 4 points they say could have changed the outcome of his trial. Allen's attorneys are hoping this can get his conviction vacated.
Allen's attorneys have filed new motions calling for his conviction to be vacated. Indianapolis defense attorney John Tompkins isn't affiliated with the case, but gave his expertise on the motion of errors filed Tuesday by Allen's defense attorneys. They say Allen's Sixth Amendment right was violated when his attorney was not present at an initial hearing in 2022. The attorneys say this email is evidence the state knew Allen had representation.
It's clearly not appropriate when you know a person is represented to proceed without their attorney present.
The motion also includes new video disputing the state's murder timeline presented in court. The defense says this video shows a white van arriving on the day of the murders near the crime scene at 2:45 p.m. Zoomed in, you can see the van. In court, the state told the jury the white van arrived around 2:30, spooking Allen just before he killed the girls. Tompkins says the times not lining up could be a major blow to the state.
I think any judge would have to give very serious consideration to reversing the conviction, because that was the core of their theory of the case.
Perhaps even worse for the state is if the prosecution knew part of their core story was false.
If they acted intentionally or knowingly, then you would get potentially reversal with no new trial.
In the motion, the defense also presented another suspect for the crime and an apparent confession not yet heard by the public. Logan owned the property where Abby and Libby's bodies were found. He gave investigators a phony alibi, and his home was searched by the FBI in the months after the killing.
They've tied it to actual evidence that was presented by the state at trial and arguably should have opened the door to them being able to get some of these other suspects and information about the other suspects in front of that jury.
I asked Tompkins if he thinks this could put Richard Allen's very recent conviction and sentence in hot water. He says it deserves a hearing.
So what they believe is going to happen at this point is that the state's going to have a chance to respond to this motion of errors. And after doing so, the judge will have about 45 to 60 days to respond to that. And more than likely, if this judge sees anything that she feels like is damning, then, and I'm so glad it's a female judge, then she could come back and say, okay, let's have a hearing and let's talk about this further. Let's watch this other one real quick.
Right after his arrest, Richard Allen's wife paid an attorney $5,000 to represent him. The defense team filed this exhibit, a letter from that attorney to the Carroll County Sheriff saying Allen is his client. The defense claims Allen's constitutional rights were violated because that attorney was not involved in the hearing that sent him to the Westville Correctional Facility. By attacking the safekeeping order, the defense appears to be trying to get his confessions made at Westville thrown out of the trial altogether, claiming he was there illegally.
It's a good strategy to try to say, hey, let's knock out all the confessions, via the Westville thing. He never should have been in Westville. Let's get rid of all of that. So it makes sense that they're doing this.
The defense is also trying to discredit the state's timeline of the murders of Abby and Libby. They claim this video showing a blurry vehicle driving down a road is this white van, the infamous white van Allen later confessed to seeing around the time the girls were abducted. The defense claims the video shows the van arriving after the state says it arrived, but they do admit the time code is 12 hours off.
They're acknowledging this is off. Is there any way to determine that it's exactly 12 hours off? Or is this a situation where it could be 12 hours and 30 minutes, 12 hours and 20 minutes?
That couple right there that they were just interviewing, that's the one that has the podcast that's been following this from the get-go. They brought a lot of attention to this case. I want to know what their thoughts are further in this.
The defense also claims newly discovered confessions from the man who owned the property where the girls were murdered entitles Allen to a new trial. The confessions were allegedly made in 2017 to a fellow inmate by the man while he was serving time in prison just months after the murders.
I would expect that either there's going to be a hearing or prosecutor Nick McClelland is going to file some sort of response to this.
The defense also says testimony about Libby's phone is an error in the case because an investigator testified that he used Google to come up with his explanation that dirt and water caused Libby's phone to register something being plugged into it, hours after her death when Allen could not have been at the scene. That testimony was in direct contrast to the defense team's phone expert who testified that someone had to have plugged something in and that dirt and water would not have caused that to happen.
No trial is perfect. Every trial is going to be, have a number of errors. But what you have to look for is did that error violate Allen's rights and impact the outcome? Or is it just sort of a side issue that you can say, well, it didn't matter either way?
Sounds to me like it's a lot more than just a couple of side issues. This seems pretty deep. One of the jurors they did speak with in a podcast, and I know I've talked to you guys about this, the Murder Sheet podcast interviewed an anonymous juror on this trial. And this is the notes that I made from that podcast. And if you guys haven't heard it and you are interested further, go over to the Murder Sheet podcast and listen in. They say that the juror told them that the juror questionnaire asked if they were familiar with Odinism. Talking about the defense attorneys, she said that one of them made the jurors feel comfortable when they were being questioned at the beginning, and she was impressed with him. But the main guy, Brad Rosie, she said he had a bad start. He was insulting and intimidating, like he had a big ego. So she said for her, he was like, oof. But then she says, well, I didn't have a bad vibe with the defense, but many jurors thought that the defense attorneys were a bit much. She spoke about Richard Allen's eyes, and she said she thought they were different and weird. So she would refrain from looking at him. Some jurors talked about how he stared at the jurors and sometimes the gallery. She said she did make eye contact with him one time and he smiled. They were not sure. The jurors were not sure about all the media attention. They had no idea of it. They were kept pretty away from all that. They got along. All the jurors got along pretty well, and they became tight-knit group. She described all the jurors as very smart. She said everybody kind of had a different profession, and bringing it all together kind of helped them put all of the information that they gathered together. She said prosecution came off more professional than the defense did. She liked Jennifer from the defense team, though, and she liked McClelland. She said his closing did leave a lasting impression on her, though. That's big. She was confused by some of the questions about signs on the trees and branches because they didn't know about the Odinism, because it was not allowed to be brought into the court. She said the defense team seemed to scramble and be confused at times. But that one defense attorney, Rosie, he just rubbed her the wrong way. She had issues with Richard Allen's second interview with police detectives. Apparently, during deliberations, the jury did rewatch all of the interviews. They had a hard time with how harsh the detectives were on him in the interrogation, and she said her personally, it really bothered her a lot. Some jurors did have mixed reviews on it, though. They said this is the way it's done, and she said I just felt like it was a little bit too tough. She felt like Richard Allen was too calm in the interview, like he didn't know anything. So for him to have done it, it just didn't fit. And she said also the fact that he didn't have any prior crimes. She thought that the prosecution did lack in some areas. She thought that in some bits and pieces they weren't prepared. They also had a lot of tech problems on the prosecution side, computer tech problems. Now, she mentions the Westfield videos, and when she says Westfield, she's speaking of the Westfield prison. They saw camcorders walking through the prison, and it wasn't as bad as she expected. She personally knew the prison was bad. During recordings, Rick was in a wheelchair, and he was going to get an x-ray because he had been beating his head on the wall. He was black and blue, and she said it was really horrifying to see how bad he looked. She said they also saw some of the video where he was naked, but they did try to blur some of that out. Powerful witnesses to her was the Master Chief Harshman. She said he was very professional. They didn't like one of the female witnesses, Sarah. And she said when defense came up to cross her that they pretty much washed her testimony out. So they didn't even consider her testimony when they were doing deliberations. She was skeptical about the bullet. And in the end, the jury decided that the bullet science wasn't going to hold up. So they threw that part out too when they were in deliberations. They said that they thought Dr. Warren was a strong witness. So during deliberation, she said the foreman did a great job. He'd been on a jury before, and she said in deliberations, they made a timeline kind of going through everything that they heard. And they put everything on this timeline at first. And then if anything was questioned, like a piece of evidence or something, they would remove it from the timeline. They had all the physical evidence inside the jury room while they were doing all this. Originally, it was 3 undecided and 9 guilty. When the van piece came up, it did stand out to all the jurors. But on their side, it didn't stand out in a negative way. It made him seem guilty. They spent one day watching the videos all together. And at the end of the day, there were 4 undecided and 8 guilty. And when I say videos, we're talking about the interrogations. But that van evidence that she's mentioning, if it's off by 30 or 40 minutes, that means that that's a huge problem in this case. Her thoughts were, who would confess that many times if they didn't do it? She said that one jury posed the question, if it was him or if it wasn't him, then who could it be? Had the defense been able to bring in these other suspects and at least pose that there's a possibility that there's other people that were being questioned and looked at and had some ties to the different things, it wasn't cut and dry. Would that have made a difference in the jury? One thing that kept grabbing them was the clothing that he had on and the video of Bridge Guy. It matched up and it was just too much. She said one thing that bothered her personally was that in her mind, they weren't supposed to focus on any of the other possible suspects, only Richard Allen. Again, leading towards the fact of, it's like they're telling him either he did it or nobody did it. That just doesn't make sense to me. She said some jurors were feeling sympathetic towards Richard Allen. The items that helped her in her decision was that he and an eyewitness both agreed to seeing each other on that day. One of the girls in the group of girls did see him in passing. And he admitted that he was there that day. She said that was a problem and that it was all fitting the timeline that they had put out, that he was there on the trail and he admitted to being there on the trail. She said once they came to the conclusion that Richard Allen was in fact Bridge Guy, based upon the clothing and everything. There was no disputing any further, and there was no further explanation needed. And that's how they came to him being guilty. She said that the things that Alan reported himself is what made him look guilty. The things that he talked about. She said the timeline was stronger than confessions. The timeline was stronger than his confessions. Again, going back to if the timeline's not right, then The deliberation was not as heated as she thought it would be. They all realized they weren't friends before this and that they had different beliefs and different pasts, but they were all very cordial to one another. That Monday, when they all came to an agreement, she said the foreman had them all make a list of certainties, things that were put out that they now know and things that they believe to be true. And I will say that by the way that she was putting all this out in the podcast and explaining all this, I could tell she was one of the undecided votes. You could tell by the way she was talking. They then wrote down what they did not believe or know. And that eventually dwindled down during open discussions. And then the next vote was unanimous. She said she was crying, and at that point, because she was so overwhelmed and felt the outcome would suck no matter what they did. She has since been on Reddit and now knows the things that were withheld. And she's just, her comment towards that was, now this was before the gag order was lifted that she said this, okay, is that she's just trusting in the judge's decisions. But she did admit that since being on social media, she's heard a lot of inaccurate information. Yeah, there's inaccurate information. Some of the stuff I might be giving out is I mean, how do we know, you guys? Let's watch this one last piece, and then we're going to talk about some other speculative pieces that her defense attorneys have said since the gag order was lifted.
Right now, Richard Allen is in prison for killing Abby Williams and Libby German back in 2017. Our Samantha Johnson is here now after digging into these new documents today. Sounds like a pretty significant development here, Sam.
Yeah, there was information in here that we hadn't heard of before. So there was new information to break down. This motion here is 24 pages, and it really outlines what the defense team believes are 4 main mistakes that they say could have changed the outcome of Richard Allen's trial.
Late Monday night, Allen's attorneys filing a motion to correct errors, which is different than the appeal we were all expecting. Former prosecutor and defense attorney Brad Banks says this essentially hits the pause button on the appeal process.
Basically, you're telling the court, hey, there were some mistakes made, and we think you should fix them.
The first error, according to the defense, the safekeeping order that sent Allen to solitary confinement at Westville Correctional Facility. The defense lists a number of reasons it was, quote, plainly illegal from start to finish. And that's important because Allen's attorneys argue if he hadn't been there, those prison confessions used against him wouldn't have ever happened. Another issue is about the timeline of the murders. The defense claims the state allowed false evidence, testimony about when a white van drove by the crime scene, which they say contradicts actual security video near the Monon High Bridge Trail.
I just want to say one thing really quickly about the van. I started this earlier and I never finished it. Okay, so this van, this guy that lives on this back road by where all this occurred, he owned the van and he usually got home a certain time during the day. On this particular day, he admitted that he had gone to some extra properties for work before coming home, which means he came home later. I think it was later than what he had normally come home. And that is where the discrepancy lies. It's so crazy that this van could be the piece in the case that's just so, it's so freakish. The defense believes that the van information was fed to Richard Allen somehow through interrogations and through the questioning of the different, this doctor, this medical person who's not supposed to have any bias in the case, that did have bias in the case. So that's how they believe that he spoke of the van and that it spooked him. And that's what made him unalive the girls. I guess the story was that he was going to sexually assault them.
Conflicting arguments about evidence related to the headphone jack on Libby's cell phone found at the crime scene. Now, Allen's attorneys are asking the court to overturn his conviction or schedule a hearing to talk about the motion.
I don't understand the headphone jack. Let's go back.
A third issue, conflicting arguments about evidence related to the headphone jack on Libby's cell phone found at the crime scene. Now, Allen's attorneys are asking the court to overturn his conviction or schedule a hearing to talk about the motion.
This will get us to the next big phase, which is probably going to take a year and a half or more, which will be the appeal in this case.
Yeah, but if it doesn't go to appeal, okay, so appeal may not even be an issue if this comes through and the judge has a hearing and she hears something that she feels like if this either needs a retrial or they throw it out altogether. The judge is not going to want to put these families through another trial. This is scandalous, you guys. So here are the discrepancies that I had written down. This part that I was making notes on was someone who had actually interviewed the attorneys. It was on Lawyer Lee's channel. These are my notes. I'm going to read to y'all. They talk about how they ended up on the case originally. They didn't know each other before they all came together as a defense team. They refer to Richard Allen as Rick. They say that third party and Odinism was excluded. One of the attorneys was like, no, I don't believe in, conspiracy theories. Don't even talk about that. But the other attorney was kind of open-minded about it because he had heard about Odinism. He was a little bit familiar with it, but he was like, does it really exist, Well, they had all this paper evidence that showed that maybe it does exist. And then they started looking at the previous suspects in the investigation. They said on April 3rd, the night after Rick had gone mad, they were waiting at the prison in a different area. And when they saw the prison, this one guy that was familiar with Odinism, he saw the prison guard come in, and he saw on a patch on both prison guards, it said, "In Odin we trust." And the symbols for each of them were on the patches as well. Y'all, that is freakish. It's patches on the uniform. What? I thought originally he was talking about tattoos. Now, this other attorney that had heard about this before had mentioned it to the one that didn't believe in conspiracy theories. And he was like, no. But when he saw those security guards come in with those patches and they pointed it out, he was like, holy crap. So there was an 80-something page letter to the prosecutors from one of the police officers, and various guards admitted to being part of Odinism. So there's a couple of police officers that would talk to the defense or had spoken to the defense that were basically shut down and not allowed to talk. When they started realizing that Odinism theory wasn't crazy, they went in and they started looking at different things. And they realized that there's actually a tattoo shop across from the courthouse. It was called Odin's Den. Another thing that they brought up was that, it was 3 police officers that they had been speaking with that they got the vibe that Richard Allen wasn't guilty. So Abby was dating this guy's son, right? And this guy's social media, the father, it showed all kinds of Odinism signs. And there was actually an image of 2 girls on the ground with sticks around them. It looked very similar to the crime scene. I know it sounds crazy. They thought it sounded crazy too when they saw it. But then they started putting it all together and they're like, holy crap. Another thing that really stuck to them was that there were no drag marks on the ground from the bodies being moved around. And they do know that the bodies were moved based upon the blood evidence. So how could there only be one person involved? They brought up the white van. They said that, first of all, it wasn't even a white van. It was a van, and somehow or another, through all this, it became the white van. But I don't even think the van was white. They said that the Hammond Police Department interviewed the owner of the van, who said he didn't come straight home that day, and he would not have driven by at the time that they said he drove by. That's when they believed that the cops weren't telling the truth. So the van part kind of solidified the road that they were going down with. Something's just not right here. They also brought up this Ron Logan guy, his voice, his property, his past. And they felt that Richard Allen was being pressured and under duress while he was incarcerated. So then they talk about this Dr. Wallace, Monica Wallace. Is she a doctor? I don't know. She had been on guest panels on all these different YouTubers and podcasts, and she was even admitted to being a fan of the case. And she had been involved in all this stuff prior to Richard Allen even being, because you remember this went on for 5 years before he was even arrested. So she knew all this stuff about the case, and then he gets arrested, and then she's the one in there having private discussions with him. So they had a doctor involved in the case. And what he said was he felt that the way that she reported a lot of stuff in her notes and her uploaded notes and all that, the way she did it, the way she handled everything, it was very unusual and none of it made sense. So that's what I have on this case. You know, normally I wouldn't be bringing this up. You know, I haven't talked about Sarah Boone and her whole thing because we know, well, you know, it's Sarah Boone, but I don't know, you guys. I think this deserves at least us to talk about it. It deserves, you know, another look. And whether you were watching the case or not and watching the trial, well, we couldn't watch the trial. We had to listen in on the trial. But if you had any interest whatsoever in the case, this would kind of make you perk up and go, wow. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. And I will come back and do a follow-up eventually. We'll wait till see what the judge says before we come back and do a follow-up. But keep all that in your little mind pocket, and we'll discuss it later on. I'm not one for conspiracy theories either, but this is just there's just too many things that fall into place here. This is just a really unusual case, a sad case. It's sad for so many people involved. And what if Ron Allen was the guy and he's no longer on the earth? So those families don't feel like they're going to get justice? I don't know. Or will they always, no matter what happens going forward, whether Richard Allen gets out of jail or stays in jail, they're always going to believe that he's the one that did it? It's just really, it's unfortunate. It's sad. And I hope for the sake of those that loved Abby and Libby that this does get resolved. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please do not forget to like and subscribe on your way out, and feel free to leave a comment. Have a blessed day.